Fair is the white star of twilight, and the sky clearer at the day's end, but she is fairer, and she is dearer, she, my heart's friend. Far stars and fair in the sky's bending, low stars of hearth fires in wood smoke ascending, the meadow lark's nested, the night hawk is winging, home through the starshine the hunter comes singing. Fair is the white star of twilight, and the moon roving to the sky's end, but she is fairer, better worth loving, she, my heart's friend. I've had a life of movement. Like the way the white, rough water flows with continuous energy, I have done so. Like the way the bungoos, the horses, gallop swiftly everywhere, I have done so. In my young life, I lived 11 or so years with my people who call themselves Noah, or who the white men call the Shoshone. We moved for our food, our trips seasonal and carefully timed. I loved it when we went to the rivers for the big salmon when the ice cracked apart and started melting. The ducks came in flocks as numerous as the salmon down to the water to swim and eat, while my family and others set up our lodges along the bank. I remember sticking my feet in the icy, frigid waters and wading up to my knees with other children. We squealed and shrieked with laughter as the salmon wriggled and swam in thick groups around us, tickling and slapping our skin. I remember my mother weaving sticks together for salmon basket traps. I learned the skill and loved it when my fingers slowly fell into the swift movement my mother's skilled fingers had, but didn't enjoy how they ached for days afterward. My brother watched father closely when he made his harpoons with dark, watchful eyes like the ravens. He watched and learned when father went down to the shore with other men and speared the salmon through with ease with corded, muscled arms. While I went out with the women to dig our hands into the wet, fluffy earth for root stalks and shoots, the men and boys would go out to hunt the sage-grouse, ducks, and rabbits when not fishing. While I felt the crunch of the watercress and its cool moisture on my tongue when gathering, they ate the smoky but savory meat of the sage-grouse for meals when hunting. When the evening started to descend and the moon became brighter, the men would return and many times perform the grass dance, a prayer for growth and rain. When we felt the warm winds sifting through our hair and the early salmon were gone, my family would move on out to our favored food-gathering place to the mountains for the bitterroots and the camas prairies. We packed up our smoked salmon, tools, and belongings onto the horses, and the rest we carried. The warm weather with rain and much sun gave our horses enough grass to graze on, and I learned to weave the grass into mats for our wickiups, our houses. Then, with the sweet smell of grass in our noses, we draped the mats over the wooden teepee frames to dry and shelter us. I remember looking up at the sky on my back that stretched on forever, taking a break from weaving, and seeing the grass tips dancing and twirling in the wind above my head. Agile deer with long, graceful limbs the men hunted with bow and arrow. My brother Sacagewea was much better at using a bow for the deer than a harpoon for the salmon, and when away from the adults I would tease him for it. He got very angered when I said this, but never did he tell them because I was never punished. We women and girls prepared and harvested the roots of the camas and bitterroots when the horses were grazing peacefully and the men were at camp or hunting. In the foothills where the bitterroots grow, we used elk antlers to pull up the roots, a tool we called a burro. When coming out of the foothills, we had to be careful not to fall on the crumbly rock and lose our valuable roots. The camas, with their stalks of purple flowers, whose roots we also harvested, were my favorite. We would dig large holes and in them layer dried sticks and rocks. We'd light the wood on the bottom of the holes and wait for the stones on top to heat up and collapse the wood. I remember burning my small fingers on the hot rocks while putting grass over them to shield the camas roots from the strong warmth. When the grass was applied, we would pour the camas roots in and put more grass over them, and then cover up the holes with earth. The camas roots were left alone like that for the whole of the day and then partly into the night until we took them out, perfectly cooked with a crunchy black layer around the surface. After one full moon cycle at our root grounds, we'd leave to go back to the rivers for the second salmon run. The men went back to harpooning the salmon, and I would resume learning to make salmon baskets on my own. The sun was now more intense, and the hot weather had ripened the berries by this time. While gathering the juicy morsels, some sweet and sour, I would experiment which tasted better out of sight from the women, popping them into my mouth when their backs were turned and their attention on other things. We'd not only make gotsap, pudding, out of the chokeberries, elderberries, currants, juniper berries, and service berries, but would pound the berries with stone hammers into cake patties that were dried in the warm sun and used in the cold season. During this time of berries and salmon, we were already planning for another trip towards food. It was a time for the mighty buffalo hunts in lands further away where the grass spread out as far as you could see. The air was hinting at the coolness that would soon come, and it was charged with decisions and apprehension. This journey was a time of heightened danger. Our tribe was enemies with the Blackfeet, Asani, and Hidatsas. We had already been attacked and pestered for a while from these tribes, and we Nawa were starting to become distressed with the robbery. Some were starving. Going on these buffalo hunts put us in a more critical situation as we became split up, some going on the hunt while others had to stay behind due to horse limitations. I remember long talks between the men in the lodges, the smoke curling out of the tops of them in gray billows like storm clouds. My family usually had many horses, and every year since I could remember I went along. Horse sweat, the beating sun, and strong squalls we rode through in a certain tension as we watched for the gun-possessing Hidatsas is what I recall on those trips. The eagles soared over the plains when we got to our destinations. We'd set up our camp with our witchy-ups and wait for the buffalo if we had to. Although a sense of danger was always there, the men and boys were excited to get the hunt going. When the buffalo were spotted, they went with whoops and soaring hearts on top of the horses into the horizon. When the buffalo hunts were successful and bountiful and the meat was brought in, our hearts were happy and the camp was busy. We started tanning buffalo hides, peeling them away from the buffalo flesh to later be dried and eaten during the cold season. As the sun started to set earlier and the snow clouds could be seen coming, we moved to our cold season camps back towards the rivers. River valleys where wood, protection, and water could be found were best in the high mountains where the small animals were. There, we were protected from the enemies, too. Warmer clothes were put on, buffalo hides put up over our witchy-ups instead of grass, and we hunkered down in them telling the stories of our ancestors. The flickering of the fire illuminated our faces as we'd eat our dried salmon, buffalo, and berry patties as well as whatever we had at that time. We all took this time to prepare our tools and clothing so they could be strong for the warmth that would come soon and for the next cycle of the season's movement.